rhoi darlith hwn yn Cymraeg un dydd one day, ond nid heddiw, so I'll continue in English. But I do hope one day to be able to share this in Welsh. So let's begin. Hopefully, all things going well, you can now see the title, Islam of Wales, and we can get started. So thank you again, Ellen, for that introduction. And thank you too for the recognition of the circumstances in Cardiff University, circumstances which sadly, I think are facing many higher education institutions in Wales and beyond. For me, it only emphasizes how important the work we do as academics, historians, scholars in the humanities is. And I do think we have an important role to play. One of the things, because I'm a sojourner into history, I should say this, as Ellie mentioned, I have a background in sociology, ethnography. I'm a sociologist of religion by training. So I kind of decided to pretend to be a historian for this particular project. And the community's been welcoming and hasn't challenged me on my lack of credentials. But one of the things I think I really recognized about history is that our understanding of history very much dictates our understanding of the future. So the broader, more deep, more incisive your understanding of the experience of humanity in the past, the broader your horizons, the more ambitious, creative, and I think open your perception of the future is. And likewise, it's impossible to escape discussions around the future of Wales, the future of Britain, kind of a rise of a type of uncivic nationalism, which is found on both sides of the Atlantic. There's many things to say about that, but I think one of the things is that it does draw on a particular type of history, and that history is very narrow. And equally, the future, the perspective of how we can, as a country, as a nation, as a people, move into the future is equally narrow and constricted. So I think history has a very important role to play, and there is a really important need, more than ever, I think, to defend it. But I'm going to speak now about the findings from this project, which is something I love doing, and I will hopefully be able to do it in 50 minutes or less. But I do have the tendency sometimes to go off track, so if I do, forgive me. The project.
Just before you move on to your next slide, just to let you know that what we're seeing on screen is the main slide, but also the next slide and the notes. So just in case you want to share another version.
No, that's thank you for pointing that out, because we had done a test run just beforehand, and the test run clearly sorry, 2 seconds.
Yeah, that was okay. That was
okay. Yeah. So we had done a test run, and I think lulled ourselves into a false sense of security, thinking everything.
That's fine.
I think I lulled myself into a false sense of security. So hopefully you can only see the presentation slides now. Great. So the project was a 3-year project. It was funded by the Jameel Educational Foundation. And I'm very grateful to them. And I always mention this because it's the type of project which is very difficult to secure funding through something like a research council, because it was very exploratory and it's very broad. And the research councils tend to know a bit more about what they're going to find before they fund the work. This was much more an exploratory project that sort of seeing, well, what is out there? What is the available history? And so I'm very grateful for the Jameel Educational Foundation for funding this work through my post and some of the associated costs. And it kind of looked at a huge range of, historical documents from archives, newspaper records, existing oral history interviews, as well as undertaking several 35 new ones, and collecting family artifacts and heirlooms, documentation, letters that people had lying around attics, and similar. And the real goal was to get a sense of the story of Muslims in Wales, to get a sense of that settlement, and really taking a very long view of it, from the earliest point of contact right the way through to more or less the contemporary period. And the outputs are something we're working on at the moment. Currently I'm working on 2 books, which will hopefully be available in the next few years. But also we have an exhibition that is currently, I think it's still there, at Glamorgan Building in Cardiff University. And it was previously displayed at the Eisteddfod in Rhondda Cynon Taf this year, well, last year. And we're hoping in probably 2026 to be able to take you around small museums and heritage sites across Wales. So there is this element of taking some of the findings on tour. But equally, one of the other outputs, I'll just let everyone have a kind of gander at them for the next slide, was this map of Muslim Wales. Because the findings are very diverse and, range from very kind of odd pieces of historical nuggets almost, right the way through to more significant aspects of, the settlement and movement of communities across the world. And so as part of the exhibition, we produced this map just illustrating across Wales some of the connections and pieces of heritage to be found. I don't think anyone will be able to see this, but I can send a link afterwards. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this yet beyond the exhibition. I think it has maybe a role it can play in education and classrooms. And a few people have asked me to kind of help them use it, provide as a gift. So hopefully it'll be something that's available more widely in due course. But much of it is to emphasize the fact that the history of Muslims in Wales isn't contained to port cities or the south of Wales. It is something to be found across Wales. It's part and written into the landscape. And all histories are like this, but sometimes we can compartmentalize histories. And I think the history of diversity in Wales, the history of Muslims in Wales, has sometimes solely been seen through the prism of Cardiff, and I don't think that's fair to understand the full picture. So I'm going to go through what are chapters. They're not necessarily the chapters of a book I'm writing, but they are chapters because they help give a sense of story. And story was a word that came out very strongly amongst research participants, especially those with oral histories, who are kind of contributing their life experiences, sometimes very moving, sometimes very personal. And I think largely it's because story is something that we can share. We can share stories. We can share stories at the dinner table. We can share stories with friends. Research findings or outputs, not so much. They can be a bit dry. So the element of a story, I think, is important. But I also find that challenging because, meta-narratives are definitely out of fashion at the moment in terms of historical theory and even social theory. And also you have an attachment to the details, especially having done the research. I want to give the nitty-gritty. So I'm trying to do both. Whether I have successfully done it or not is a decision you can make at the end. But I'm hoping to give a sense of the broad trends while also being able to give a sense of the living, breathing figures who have made up history as we go through it. And I tend to begin right at the beginning. What has Merthyr to do with Medina, the shared civilizational paradigm? And every time I give this lecture, I always spend too much time at the beginning and have to rush at the end. So I'm going to go through this much quicker than I normally would. And it's only to say that one of the earliest points of contact we can kind of identify between what we might call the Britain, British Isles, Wales, and the broader Muslim world. And I hope you can already sense there's an awkward terminology there, terminologies that tend to divide up, the European part of the world and the Middle Eastern and South Asian part of the world, that divide up Christendom and Islamdom and create kind of boundaries that are helpful and important in trying to describe history and peoples and civilizations, but can equally be misleading and obscuring. And one of the things I want to stress here is the shared civilizational paradigm in which everything from Merthyr right the way through to Medina and contemporary Saudi Arabia existed. And so King Offa is a wonderful place to start. He was an Anglo-Saxon king, very famous for building the earthwork, which more or less follows the contemporary boundary between Wales and England. And he's also known for having minted a coin, which has the inscription of Offa Rex, his regal stamp, but also the Islamic declaration of faith, La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. There's a picture of one side of it here, the Arabic around the side, and his stamp in the middle on screen there. And the significant thing about this is that it shows that there was a mutual awareness and potentially even trade and contact between, at the time, the Abbasid Empire and that of King Offa's. And there's several theories running about why he would have minted this, if at all. Some suggested it was an imitation of the Abbasid dinar, which would have had a credibility for its regular gold content. Others suggested it was nothing more than minting coins he had come into contact with a new stamp with very little attention paid to what else was on there. But the point is, I emphasize is this shared paradigm and this shared civilizational context. We can look at other points as well. So the Crusades is another important point of contact, and the fact that one of the most important cultural foundational aspects documents of Welsh history is the Journey of Wales through Wales by Gerald was recruiting Welshmen to go and fight in the Crusades against Muslims. This was a world in which there was antagonism. But the thing I kind of want to stress is within this antagonism, sometimes you can miss that they are in a type of communication. They share a particular, foundational set of concepts and ideas that allow a degree of mutual intelligibility. And this is usually where I spend too long, but I often give the example of imagining a Welshman who did join the Crusades and a Muslim Saracen, and how they meet and they trade insults, and they might trade insults with exactly the type of insults or antagonistic statements written by Christians about Muslims in this period of time, and equally by Muslims about Christians in this period of time. And so the Christian might insult the Muslim by describing him as a follower of the Antichrist and an infidel. And likewise, the Muslim might insult the Christian crusader with terms like a polytheist or a idol worshipper. And both would be, in this hypothetical scenario, both would be infuriated and kind of swords clash. But the fact that both these insults from both sides were mutually intelligible isn't something we should overlook. The idea that a Muslim would understand entirely why Antichrist is an insult, and likewise that a Christian would understand why being accused of idolatry or polytheism is an insult, is because there are these shared foundational concepts between these civilizations. And there are examples and parts and points of contact that we could dwell on, but I'm going to move on very quickly. I will stop very quickly just to point out that the very first Welshman I've identified and have seen identified in the historical record who was a Muslim happens to be a pirate, which is either very cool or a bit of a shame, depending on your perspective. He was captured in a naval battle, discovered to be a Muslim. This is 1671, Charles II State Papers. There's a extract on screen at the moment. And he was put to death upon inspection, closer inspection, which I'm making the inference would be circumcision. And he's called a renegado, someone who's renegade. And here you can see the significance of conversion to Islam as being something which is more than just something how the modern person might view it, which is a choice and something which can be changed, and seen much more as a sign of treacherous behavior and disloyalty in the most extreme sense. But nonetheless, we find our first reference to a Welsh Muslim, the renegado, who was put to death in 1671 by the English. And he's not the only pirate or kind of entrepreneurial convert in this period. There were many. There were figures like Hassan Ali, who was a treasurer in Algiers, a very senior figure in the authorities and a very wealthy one, who happened to be from Yarmouth. There's figures like Thomas Keith, who was a Scotsman and became the governor of Medina. Forgive me. So you have many individuals who do travel in the Muslim world and kind of ascend through various ranks in the empires of the time. And this also gives you a sense of the balance of power during this period. Muslim empires were very much ascendant. Sorry. And European powers are very much on the periphery. And that, of course, all changes when it comes to the era of empire, especially the rise of the British Empire. And this is an important period as a turning point in the kind of story, because this is the period in which Muslims and Britain as a whole, but Wales in particular, come into much more sustained contact. And for the purposes of our story, forgive me, I didn't realize my throat was as sore as it is. I blame it on having two children who seem to bring back different bugs every single week, and I think it's a cumulative thing going on. But the story of empire and Wales is very much I mean, it's an incredibly complicated one, taking those three kind of aspects of the picture: Wales, Islam, and the British Empire. And exploring two of those, any two of those, is not at all straightforward. Looking at all three of them is really contending with very contradictory narratives, very complex ways in which the Welsh viewed the British imperial project, the ways in which they were both part of and subject to. And the same can be said for Muslims as well. It would be naive to imagine that the imperial project, the British imperial project, was not utilized and taken advantage of by Muslims. Many, especially towards the latter end, and we'll see some of this later on, didn't adopt a framework that saw themselves as colonized, but saw themselves as subjects in a global empire of which they benefited from. They saw the British Empire as a Mohammedan empire, one which was capable of defending Muslim interests on a global stage. And this became even more pronounced after the First World War. So it's not to say that this is the only narrative. There are many different ways in which we can look at the imperial project and the various ways in which it interacted, but it definitely wasn't a singular narrative which was available. But for the purpose of our story here, it's worth stating that we can think of empire as a wave going out, a wave of three types of people: mercenaries, merchants, and missionaries. And they bring back to Wales wealth, plunder, and spoils of war. And these are very viscerally available to view sometimes. You can go to Powis Castle, and again, the complexities there, a Englishman who had a second home in Wales full of plunder and wealth, not a straightforward story. But in Powis Castle in Wales today, you will find the greatest collection, the largest collection of Mughal artifacts outside of Delhi. So not outside of India, but outside of Delhi. It's an incredible collection. It's over 2 or 3 generations of service to the East India Company and then the Raj through which it's collected. And it's a testament of that literal extraction of wealth and money from India in particular in benefit of Britain. You can look at places like St. Peter's Church in Pentra, just outside of Cardiff, where the battle flag of the Sudanese Mehdi, which was captured by British forces at just, I think it was 1896 was the Battle of Toski, which was captured by British forces, is on display. Part of the battle flag is on display. And again, that's a very visceral sign of the kind of spoils of war. And this kind of gives us a sense of that story. And there were also merchants, there's been some wonderful work on this published recently in a work by the University of Wales Press, edited by Neil Evans and Charlotte Williams, which kind of looks at the kind of network of Nawabs, the kind of new rich company men who had gone out with the East India Company and came back very much enriched. And again, you find these different type of figures. So someone like Clive of India, I think William Dalrymple calls him sociopathic. But you can also find figures like David Price, who had a home in Brecon, which he retired. He was from Brecon, part of quite a well-connected family. And, he learned Persian and translated works of Persian into English, someone who was much more, I think, appreciative of the world in which he encountered in India. And then you have missionaries, of course. And I think, again, sort of depending on who you speak to, sometimes the missionary project is kind of seen as very much entwined with the colonial project. But you also find some of the most, I think, insightful writing in English during that period about Islam. And it's written from a point of religious antagonism and competition, but it also takes the religious experience and faith of the Muslims they meet and Islam quite seriously. And often when you compare that to more contemporary writings, you can sense a difference because it's coming from a perspective which is very much rooted in treating that aspect of a person's identity and practice as very serious and weighty and worthy of consideration. And I'll mention here a kind of a historical connection, one which for me is quite personal, but also I think has a certain poetry to it. And I'm always careful about sharing this because in the wrong context or with the wrong tone, it can come across as religious chauvinism, but that's not my intention. It's more the historical connection and the kind of symmetry that is there. So one of the most active missions in Sylhet at the time, which is a part of contemporary Bangladesh, was the Welsh Calvinist Methodists, contemporary Presbyterians. And they had opened just at the turn of the century, 1905, I think, a new chapel on Cruise Road in Cardiff. And this is exactly when there's still kind of missionary presence in Sylhet. So there was Eisteddfod in Sylhet in 1901, and there were similar kind of missionary projects. And about 100 years later, Sylheti Muslims, so almost I think 90% of Bangladeshis in the UK are from Sylhet, a particular region of Sylhet, which has a very kind of particular language and a particular expression of Islam, which is quite different from the rest of Bangladesh. But they happen to purchase this particular chapel, which has gone on sale. And I should mention that because the Presbyterians had moved to a larger church, a much larger church not far from there. But it's a historical symmetry that I find quite interesting. You know, it would not have been the future those missionaries would have imagined. But when you open the doors that are open through the imperial project, the floodgates are opened. Everything's up for game. So wealth comes back, spoils of war come back, but so does Islam, and so do Muslims. And that's really where we get to. I think I'm probably going to change the title of this particular slide one day from the Church of Unitarian Calvinists, which I think is trying to be too clever. So forgive me. I think probably change it to Chapel Islam, or maybe just converts, because that's what we're going to talk about now, which is the earliest converts, Welsh converts to Islam. And the Unitarian Calvinist, that comes from Samuel Evans. He writes in Aguro Feka Ikreved that it'd be possible with a great deal of justification to call Muslims Unitarian Calvinists. And I love that because it does two things. I think first, it emphasizes something which is often overlooked, which is that from the perspective of Islam on Muslims, Islam is a Christian reformation. So the way in which kind of world religions framework teaches religion in schools is, you kind of separate the traditions out and you think of them as very much their own thing, their own continents. But, from the sort of insider perspective, there is a continuity. And Islam is very much seen as a Christian reformation. And of course, if you're on the other side of the perspective, it's very justified to look at it as a Christian heresy. So he perceives something which I think is very easily overlooked about the relationship between Christianity and Islam. But equally, this is a period of nonconformism. And I think in the figures we're going to look at, it's quite useful to think of their experience and conversion to Islam as part of the nonconformist religious exploration of the era. That can be a very helpful way in which to see these particular experiences and conversions to Islam, because they all date from the same kind of long century. So there are three figures, and there are only three of many figures that I could have spoken about. You have the Baron of Alderley, the third Baron of Alderley, Henry Stanley, on the left there. In the middle, you have Omar Rees Rankin, Sir Omar Rees Rankin. And on the right, you have Khadija Amelia Baksh. I say you have the Khadija Amelia Baksh, you have her grave. And also, I think Susan's there, and I think Susan's on the call as well. So she's been a very big support and help in the project. And these three figures, are three converts that kind of date from the Victorian period into the early part of the 20th century. And each has an incredible story. So Khadija Amelia Baksh, from a Welsh-speaking family, born in Carmarthen, moves to Cardiff for her teen years, and then in London for her 20s. She meets there a Muslim lawyer, Indian lawyer, Sheikh Miran Baksh. She converts and marries him, but then at a very young age, I think 26, she passes away suddenly from an aneurysm and is brought back to a chapel, her family chapel in Bethlehem Chapel in St. Clears, Carmarthen, West Wales, and is buried there under her Muslim name. And it's the first identifiable Muslim grave. So sometime in 1892 or 93, forgive me, my dates are not in my head at the moment. But it's the first identified Muslim grave, and I hope someone finds an earlier grave. But I think again, kind of is a wonderful piece of history to be aware of and to be able to share. I'm going to skip over Omar Rees Franklin, but he is briefly the head of the British Muslim Society, which was founded by Sir Omar Headley. So Omar Headley liked to trace his lineage back to, I want to say Llewellyn Fawr, but he used to claim, to be from Welsh royalty, and he was also a Muslim convert, a member of the House of Lords. Omar Rees Franklin was his sort of protege. After he passed away, he took over leadership, but he didn't manage a few weeks before he had disagreements and just gave up on it. But on the left is the third Baron of Alderley, Henry Stanley, and he is the first Muslim member of the House of Lords. He was a diplomat who served in the Ottoman Empire, part of the British Commonwealth Office, or British Foreign Office, sorry, before converting in 1859. When his father passed away, he assumed the title in 1869. And he is an incredibly unique and interesting figure. And even now, I'm kind of coming across new sources because I've been looking at the Ottoman archives. But he was a multilingual individual. He was almost certainly the first Arabic speaker in the House of Lords. He was someone who, I mean, I only discovered this over Christmas. He had published a sharh of Fiqh al-Akbar. So essentially published a commentary in Arabic of a text which is used by scholars of Islam as a kind of primer to advanced jurisprudence. So you'd only do that with a degree of confidence and competence and training in the tradition itself. It's not like an early work that you might look at if you're a convert, or it might be something that's interesting to the general public. It was very much a scholarly work. And the more I look into him, the more I realize that he was someone who had, in this 10-year period of his life where we know very little, sort of really embraced the study of Islam quite deeply in circles where he was almost certainly rubbing shoulders with senior scholars of the Ottoman Empire. But the thing that's most significant about him in terms of the story to Wales is that his family held land in Anglesey in North Wales. And there are 5 churches in Anglesey which he refurbished. They're old medieval churches. And as Baron, he kind of took upon himself to sort of fund their restoration as they'd been falling into disrepair. And the churches appealed to him as Baron to be able to fund their restoration, and he did. But in each of those works, in each of those churches, he requested the installation of Islamic style stained glass windows with geometric patterns to avoid kind of representations of the human form. Sort of you have this now legacy in churches like Llanpadrig, which is probably the most famous one on the northern tip of Anglesey, a old historic Welsh church, one of the oldest sites of worship in Wales, with Islamic stained glass windows. So it's a wonderful kind of piece of history, a piece of his legacy. And I think quite interesting as well, because after he passed away, there's quite a lot of debate about, was he really a Mohammedan, given he funded churches. And there were Muslims who were writing back in the papers saying, "Oh, well, it's completely part of the Islamic tradition to take care of places of worship and so on." But he did actually appeal to the Ottomans, to the Ottoman Mufti at the time, to have a fatwa to give him permission to do this. So he was someone, again, who was in contact. And again, that's something I've only found recently in the Ottoman archives with the help of a colleague who has access to them. So I've done that mistake of speaking too long on the early section, so I'm going to have to run through it. But I will try and give each section its weight and its due. But I think there is a wonderful connection between chapels, because many chapels, especially those many chapels have been put up for sale, and the Muslim communities in various places in Wales purchased them. But you see this wonderful continuity. This is Blaenau Chapel, and now Blaenau Mosque, in the valleys, and you kind of see this continuity in the use, in the worship, in the role it plays in the community, in the kind of family and connections that are present there. So this was submitted as part of a photo competition we held to launch the project. And it's one of my favorite photos because it shows that continuity that is present. And I think, again, we can go back to the idea of Islam as Unitarian Calvinism, another expression of nonconformism in a country which had got, at that point, a significant degree of religious freedom and religious diversity within the Christian framework. But we've moved now to Cardiff, and we can look at one of the most overlooked figures, I think, in probably British Muslim history, definitely, but more broadly as well, which is Sheikh Abdullah Ali al-Hakimi. Now, al-Hakimi was a individual born in sometime around 1900 in Yemen. He spent his teenage years studying in Aden. He joined the military then, the Adenese Labor Corps. That was his first protocol, and then he became a Lascar working on ships until at some point in his late 20s, he heard about someone called Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi in Algiers, a sheikh, a Sufi sheikh who had been gaining followers in the French colony. And he went and studied with him until he passed away in 1934, achieving the title of sheikh within his fellowship within the Tariqa, and being given the responsibility to teach and preach Islam in Europe, which he did. So in 1936, he arrives in Britain. And he spends his time between South Shields, not far from Newcastle, I think technically within Newcastle, and Cardiff before finally settling in Cardiff. And he has a career there that spans from 1936 until 1952, when he returns to his Yemen, with a brief period during the war when he had taken a short trip to visit his homeland, Yemen, and in that period had been effectively imprisoned, but imprisoned by being given a very senior job within the Yemeni government. It was a monarchy at that point. He was given the title of the Grand Guide, the Murshid of Ta'iz, and given a salary, but effectively under house arrest because he was seen as a particularly dangerous political force. And they weren't wrong, because as soon as he came back to the UK, he was someone who was a very important figure in the move Yemen had towards a republic that would finally culminate in the 60s. But in Cardiff, he had an incredible career, and he was someone whose legacy over his 18-year career would leave a very important impact on Muslim civil society in Wales more generally, but also in Cardiff. So, he was someone who would very, easily be described as leading a revival of religious practice amongst Muslims. So there were in Cardiff, Newport, Barry, Swansea, sizable communities of Muslims who were Lascars. Some of these were transient, but some of these had settled and married locally, had children and families, and ran their own businesses in these port cities and towns. I say cities, they were towns. And he kind of led a religious revival amongst them. It was a very significant growth in fervor and practice. Who would lead public processions through the streets, collecting the community together. He would host royalty and potentates in Cardiff, including several key figures from India, the Middle East, and North Africa. And as I mentioned, he became the leader in waiting of a revolution. And during this kind of brief career, 18 years in total, he also faced several crises. He had a bitter dispute with his deputy, one that would fracture the community he had established. The shooting and the murder of his secretary, which in the British papers is called a shooting over a gambling debt, but in the Arabic language papers, and again, this is only something I've discovered over the last few weeks as I looked over them. It's described as an assassination, so something worthy of some more attention. The mosque, he had opened the very first mosque and the very first cemetery in Cardiff, and the very first Muslim cemetery mosque in Wales by virtue of that. But it was bombed during the Second World War. And towards the end, due to his role in this kind of growing revolution in Yemen, he just became the subject of international intrigue. There were security forces in Britain and in Yemen who were kind of keeping tabs on him. There was espionage and counter-espionage. A very interesting life for a figure who we know very little about and has been written about. I think not enough considering the role he played. But he was definitely a pioneer, and he's someone who did two things, and I'll mention these very briefly before moving on. But he was someone who he was someone who sorry he was someone who establish a particular type of institutionalization of Islam that Wales would continue with. So one of the things he would do is meet with political figures, including James Callaghan, the soon-to-be Prime Minister, the Mayor of Cardiff, and others. He had an official role in different types of civic ceremonies. So, he would do something similar to a christening. And I've looked into it. There's no Muslim equivalent of a christening for a ship, but he kind of, he was someone who saw this as an important function that, his counterparts, priests, would be undertaking. And so he felt something similar in the Islamic context would be worthwhile too. And, he was also officially invited to the funeral for, I really need to make sure I remember this. I want to say George, and I'm not sure which number. Let's say the fifth. Last time I gave this talk, I had the exact same problem. I forgot which king it was. But in 1952, there was a funeral for the king, and he attended in an official capacity. So this type of institutionalization of Islam, we're not going to see it for another few decades in Britain, but he was pioneering it in the 1940s and the 1950s, which really puts him at a kind of cutting edge of Muslim institutionalization. And you do see that continue. So figures like his successor, Sheikh Saeed Ismail, he was chaplain to the leader of the Glamorganshire Council in the 80s. So someone who kind of continued that civic function and role much earlier than other Muslim communities in the UK. And really none of this develops in the same level, in the same pace until the post 9/11 period. But the second thing which I think about al-Hakimi is fascinating is he represents a change in the kind of saintly narratives. And the kind of traditional saintly narratives in Islam are about the domestication of the wilderness. So the kind of stories you'll find and the figures you'll see written about tend to be individuals who are joining the kind of early movement of peoples into a new area. And that area is wild and full of demons and full of wild animals and dangers. And they are part of that domestication process as civilization is established. Al-Hakimi, along with a few other key British figures, is a kind of, fits a model of a different type of religious charisma that is invested in them in a different narrative. And this is the kind of re-enchantment of the urban. You see this in figures like Sheikh Abdullah of Birmingham, who has one of the very first British shrines. You can find British Muslim shrines. But you see in his story too, the re-enchantment of the urban and industrialized world. So I think there's something very significant about al-Hakimi. Equally so, the fact that he is kind of connecting two very global trends in Islam. So he starts his career as the leader of a tariqa, a fellowship, a type of organizing that dominated the Muslim world from 1250 to 1850, but was kind of dying out at this period. Al-Alawi, Sheikh Alawi, his teacher, was one of the few who had managed to have a successful tariqa during this period, and he establishes the tariqa in Cardiff. But by the end of his career, certainly post-Second World War, he was organizing in a much different way. He was organizing congregationally. So no longer the kind of tight tariqa with the sheikh and the fellowship, but instead a much looser affiliation based on a congregational model. People who will come into the mosque and gathering, a much looser fellowship, but one which is around a place rather than a person. And this has become, in the British context, the dominant form of religious organizing for Muslims. And in al-Hakimi's career, you can literally see that shift from tariqa to congregation. So I can speak about al-Hakimi much more, and I do hope to write about him as well because he deserves a much more extended biography. But we can move on to other figures, and the next few sections I will be rushing through, so forgive me. So Abdul Hamid is another figure I'm going to look at. He's a individual who was active during the same period, really, 1930s, 40s, 1930s and 40s, but in North Wales, in Rhyl, in particular. Sorry, I realized I didn't add it, but I have a picture of him because his great-great-grandson got in touch with me and he had lots of pictures of him. So I have a much better picture of him that I could show, but I've got to add it in. Abdul Hamid is an Indian architect. He works for the Prince of Wales's own in Jodhpur, eventually moves to the UK, takes up architectural work, and during the war is requisitioned into the Ministry of Works and settles in Rhyl for a period. And while there, he organizes the evacuees, effectively Muslim evacuees, and organizes activities, including an aid prayer in Prestatyn in 1941. A picture of it can be seen on the bottom of the slide in front of you. He's a really fervent organizer, but he also represents a particular view some Muslims had towards British Empire, which was the advocate for Muslim interests on a global stage. And he died in 1944 during the V1 bombing campaign by Nazi Germany, but only just after launching a society which didn't continue, obviously, but the Society of British Friends of the Muslim World, which had been launched in London and had kind of a huge lineup of high society figures. But he was someone who I think again represents really interesting intersection of the kind of trends. You know, they were no longer the Ottoman Empire, no longer the Mughal Empire, no longer a global Muslim actor on a global stage, and people were starting to shift to the nation state model, but not entirely. And some thought, well, Islam had always been represented by empires on the political and global stage, and a replacement was needed. Some turned towards the idea of a khilafat. So you have in India the khilafat movement coming together at this period. But some, like Abdul Hamid, invested their hopes and aspirations in the British Empire as a Muhammadan empire that could achieve what had previously been done by the Ottomans and Mughals, which is a fascinating and interesting idea, and one which you're not going to encounter in the contemporary period at all. But again, I think is worthy of exploration more deeply. And I'm going to quickly show his grave on the bottom left. It took me a while to find his grave, but he's buried in Cardiff in the Muslim section. And sadly, no gravestone is there. So the little plinth, the wooden plinth that you can just about see is the only memorial. Just dig into the ground. But he was also in being this kind of British Muslim imperialist. He hosted what are called the Indian contingent in Ril during a visit. The pictures are there on the right-hand side. And if you want to read more about the Indian contingent, Guy Bowman has a phenomenal work, which I really would encourage you to read. Quite often, when I was telling people I was doing a project on the history of Muslims in Wales, they would mention, oh, you will find Muslim graves, soldiers in Brecon, in Milford Haven, in Cardiff, and elsewhere. And the story of those soldiers is the story of the Indian contingent. Punjabi Muslims who were at Dunkirk evacuated into Britain, and then the kind of deployed different parts of Britain in different ways, including Wales, Snowdonia. Kind of really interesting story of a group of 1,000 Punjabi Muslims who were kind of popping up in different parts of rural Wales, doing different forms of kind of military work, very much used for propaganda purposes, but nonetheless serving an acting role on the home front. And here you can see all those stories come together on the right-hand side. I've still been trying to get an original scan of this. But on the right is the opening of Peel Street Mosque, which was the mosque opened by al-Hakimi. He wasn't present for this, but in 1943 in Cardiff, present there with the Indian contingent who had attended the opening. And so is on the far right, you can see, hopefully, in the wonderful strapping turban, Sheikh Abdul Hamid on the right, top right. So all of those stories kind of come together as a nexus in Cardiff at that point. So how are we doing for time? I got a few minutes, so I'm just going to hopefully wrap up. The post-war period is one that leads to a significant change in lots of different ways. On one hand, I'll just explain this briefly. Two castles with a kind of interesting link to both the beginning and end of the empire. So the first is Powis Castle, as I mentioned, Clive of India's stately home. But the others is St. Donat's, which is currently the home of United World College. That was, of course, one of the first presidents was Lord Mountbatten, who presided over the end of the British presence in India. So two castles from which you can see the full extent of the imperial project, from East India Company to its closure, which I think has a nice poetry to it. So I'll make something of it, I'm sure, which will be overly wrought, but it's an interesting tidbit nonetheless. So a few things happen in the post-war period. First is, of course, you have the most significant Muslim migration and settlement to Britain as part of rebuilding efforts, much of those from South Asia. But that tends to be, in terms of Cardiff and Wales, a secondary migration. So most came to England and then moved to Wales, often entering the tertiary industry. So that's the first significant part of that story. But the second, and this one was fascinating. So my kind of field is British Muslim studies, and the traditional narrative in British Muslim studies is Muslims in Britain were predominantly bound by their ethnic identity. So what you see is, there would be Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, there would be Somalis, and so on. And both in terms of how they're perceived by the state and how they would perceive themselves, it would be an ethnic identity first, and then a religious identity second. And then comes the rise of Muslim political consciousness. And again, this is meant to have taken place through the 80s, but most prominently in 88 with Salman Rushdie affair. Now, I wasn't alive for any of this. I was only born afterwards. So I'm taking this all on people's testimony that this is when Muslim political agency emerged. And these communities of British Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and Somalis and Arabs then reformed and began organizing on Muslim terms. And they also began to be seen on Muslim terms. They were seen as Muslims. But if I look at the newspaper records, and I have this huge database of Muslim record of newspaper coverage of Muslims from pretty much as early as I can find them. So going back to the Victorian period in most cases, right away through to 2024 when the project ended, you can track this kind of change. And initially, and in the early periods, right up to the Second World War, Muslims are Mohammedans, and often, if they're not Mohammedans, they are called Muslims or Mussulmans, which is another term that was in use. And then sometimes Hindus, which was a catch-all term for Indians, even if they're not from India, but like places like Yemen, Aden were part of the kind of Indian administration at that point, so there was some justification. And they would be also called, Arab or ethnic descriptors that would also often be deployed. But you can see that the general trend is they were seen as religious communities. And then that changes almost overnight after the Second World War. And I found that fascinating. And I think there's lots of reasons why we can perceive that to be happening. The growth of nation states, Britain losing the kind of India and ceasing to be an empire, the kind of identity and cultural and a significant shock that kind of precipitates, desire to distance as well, I think is there. But I found that to be something particularly interesting, and you can kind of see these kind of ways in which representation is taking place during this era. I'm going to skip over, again, I've done that thing of spending too long at the beginning, but there's waves of settlement we can kind of identify in the post-war period. But I'll finish by just speaking very briefly about the growth of Welsh Muslim agency. We see this with Welsh mosques. There are 57 mosques in Wales. Each one of them is congregationalist in the sense that they are run, maintained, and supported by the local congregation of Muslims who are there. Each one is a testament to the contribution of the people who founded them and a desire to exert agency, to be able to form a community and to be able to worship on their terms. Likewise, in the 90s in particular, especially led by Muslim women, were efforts at education, Islamic and Muslim education in particular. And you can see this across Wales. There was an emphasis on religious nurture in education, the establishment of political institutions like the Muslim Council of Wales, which kind of grew alongside devolution in the Assembly, then Senedd, as kind of Wales developed a new political landscape and infrastructure. But I'll end with a quote by Graham Davis. He did a phenomenal work tracing Muslims in Welsh literature, and he ends his book with this sentence: over nearly 1,000 years, the literary relationship of Wales and Islam has largely been a monologue. However, we can identify, I believe, the beginnings of the Muslim literature of Wales, the next stage of the relationship between Wales and Islam in Welsh writing, a relationship that will now, inshallah, God willing, be increasingly a dialogue of equals. So that's the last page of his work in 2011. And increasingly, we are seeing this to be the case. Over the last 15 years or so, has been a growth of Muslims in Wales who are writing both in English and in Welsh, their experiences, their stories, fiction and non-fiction. And I think it's quite an exciting time in terms of that literary scene. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm hopefully not too much over time, but thank you so much for listening and staying with me through a sort of voice and a bit of a few tangentials. Thank you.